snow fell like torn paper from a weeping sky, each flake catching the faint lantern light that lined the crooked street of the settlement. The hour was late, but no one slept. Doors cracked open, boots shuffled, whispers rose as if summoned by the cruelty of spectacle. The Caldwell family had dragged their daughter-in-law into the cold, and the town had come to watch. Olivia May Caldwell stumbled as rough hands clamped her shoulders. She was 26 and already worn thin by grief, her husband buried last spring beneath the cottonwoods. Her in-laws had never forgiven her for outliving him. Tonight their bitterness took shape. They cut her hair, the long auburn strands she had tended since girlhood, hacked away until her scalp showed pale and raw under the snow. Each lock that fell onto the frozen mud was a quiet funeral bell tolling for her dignity. Martha Caldwell, stiff in her black shawl, gripped the scissors still wet with strands, her face sharp as iron. "Shame suits you," she hissed, her voice carrying to the gawking crowd. "No woman under my roof will bring ruin to our name with her weak ways. You'll not eat our bread again." She shoved Olivia forward, and the young widow staggered, the wind biting into the torn fabric of her dress. The snow clung to her lashes, melted down her cheeks. At first glance one might think she wept, but her tears had dried hours earlier. What remained was numbness, a hollow silence deeper than the storm. Townsfolk murmured, some pitying, most wary, for pity was dangerous when it meant crossing the Caldwells. Sheriff Amos Whitfield stood near the hitching post, hat pulled low, jaw clenched. His badge gleamed dully in the lantern glow, but his hands stayed idle at his belt. He would not intervene. Not tonight. Olivia's bare feet left fragile imprints on the snow as they forced her beyond the boardwalk. A few children peered from behind skirts, eyes wide, learning too young what happens when shame is branded onto a soul. Jonas Pike, keeper of the saloon, spat tobacco into the drifts and laughed low, feeding the flames of gossip. "Look at her now. A shorn lamb in the blizzard." His words slithered into the night, meant to linger long after the scene ended. The crowd parted just enough for her to be seen, and in that widening gap she faltered. Her knees buckled, her body too cold, too broken to carry its own weight. She collapsed onto her hands, the snow biting like iron nails against her palms. The world tilted, spun, and in that dizzy blur she felt the stairs pierce deeper than the frost. Not one hand reached for her. Not one voice rose in protest. She was nothing to them, ruined, disposable. Yet from the edge of the gathering, a shadow stirred. He was taller than the others, his frame cutting against the swirl of snow like an ancient carving brought to life. Bare skin gleamed in the storm, muscles ridged and hardened by seasons that would break weaker men. His long black hair, damp with frost, clung to his shoulders, and his dark eyes watched with a stillness that unnerved. Some recognized him. Tahasuk Gray Wolf, an Apache who lived beyond the river, a figure whispered about more than spoken to. To the settlers he was both threat and mystery, a presence not easily dismissed. He had been standing there, silent, since the cruelty began, watching as though weighing the measure of the town's heart. Now, as Olivia crumpled in the snow, his boots pressed forward. The crowd recoiled, uneasy. Mothers drew their children close. Men stiffened as if bracing for a storm fiercer than the one falling from the heavens. But he did not draw a weapon, nor shout, nor curse. He only moved toward the broken woman on the ground. Olivia, dazed, sensed a shadow fall across her. She lifted her eyes and saw him, towering, the snow melting against his skin as though the cold dared not touch him. For a moment she thought death had come, a spirit from the mountains, broad-shouldered and merciless. But then his hand, scarred and enormous, reached down not in anger but in offering. Without a word, he lifted her as though she weighed no more than a child. The heat of his body stunned her, almost painful against her frozen limbs. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Martha Caldwell shrieked, her voice sharp enough to rattle shutters. "Put her down, savage. She's nothing of yours." But Taha did not look at her. His eyes, dark as wet stone, held only Olivia's face. He brushed no snow from her shoulders, offered no comfort beyond his steady grasp. Yet she felt more shielded in that silence than she had ever been beneath a roof of kin. The murmurs grew louder, a hive of judgment. "He'll take her," someone whispered. "God help her, she's gone." Another muttered, "Better death than that." The sheriff shifted but stayed still, the cowardice in his stance plain for all to see. Only Evelyn Whitfield, the sheriff's sister, let her gaze soften. She clasped her hands beneath her shawl, silent prayer etched in her face as if begging mercy to follow wherever the Apache carried Olivia. The storm thickened, a veil between the town and the two figures at its center. Olivia shivered, torn between shame and a strange flicker of safety. She did not know this man, not his tongue nor his heart, but his silence was not cruel. It was steady, like the earth beneath snow. Her lips parted as if to protest, but no words came, only a breath that fogged against the winter air. Taha shifted her weight easily against his chest. The crowd pressed closer, but none dared reach for her. His presence was a wall, immovable. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, resonant, carrying through the snowfall with the force of something undeniable. It was not a question. It was not a plea. It was the sound of fate announcing itself. "You're coming with me." The word struck the air like a hammer against iron. The crowd flinched, some in fear, others in outrage. Martha screamed again, her hands clawing at empty air. Sheriff Amos lowered his gaze, as though by looking away he could wash his hands of the moment. Jonas Pike's smirk faltered into unease. Olivia's heart thudded, torn between terror and relief. She was lifted above the scorn of her kin, above the mud and the whispers, into a space where judgment could not reach. Snow whirled around them like confetti from some cruel celebration. She felt the eyes of the town burning into her, branding her forever. And yet, within the circle of his arms, for the first time since her world had unraveled, she was not entirely alone. The storm howled, carrying their silence into the night. Around them, gossip swelled like a rising tide, but no hand moved to stop him. The giant Apache stood unshaken, his grip unyielding, his gaze locked not on the crowd but on the fragile woman in his arms. And Olivia, trembling, realized that the life she had known, of cold hearts and cruel whispers, had ended the moment those words left his mouth. The snow thickened, erasing the footprints behind them, as though the earth itself conspired to mark this night as the beginning of something no one in town could yet name. The storm followed them, though within the giant's arms Olivia felt the wind break against his body like water against stone. His stride was steady, each step sure upon the snow-cloaked earth. She clutched at his shoulder, her breath shallow, uncertain whether she trembled from the cold or from the shame still gnawing her hollow. She dared not speak. The words of the crowd clung in her ears like burrs, their judgment heavier than frost. And yet, this silence, this strange living silence, felt different. Not cruel, not sharp, but weighty and vast, as though the night itself bore witness. Through the blur of snow she glimpsed the outline of a cabin, hewn from logs darkened by years of storms. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin gray thread, carrying the faintest scent of pinewood. He nudged the door with his shoulder, and it yielded. Warmth, sudden and almost painful, wrapped around her as they crossed the threshold. The glow of firelight cast long shadows across the walls, flickering over animal hides, baskets, and rough-hewn shelves. It was not the home of a savage, as the town whispered. It was simple, solemn, and alive with the traces of a man who survived by skill, not cruelty. He set her down carefully upon a bench near the hearth. The fur blanket he drew from the wall carried the musk of smoke and earth. He wrapped it over her shoulders, tucking it close. She tried to meet his eyes, but the weight of her shame bent her gaze downward. Her hands, raw from the snow, clutched the blanket, as though it were the last fragile scrap of her dignity. He spoke no words. He moved to the fire, added a log, and the flames flared higher, painting him in amber and shadow. For a long while only the crackle of the fire spoke. Olivia's heart pounded, caught between relief and terror. She had been cast out, cut down, and now found herself under the roof of a man the town feared. She wondered if she had traded one kind of ruin for another. Her voice came out hoarse, barely audible. Why bring me here?" It was not defiance, but the desperate question of someone stripped bare. He looked at her, eyes dark and steady, but still gave no answer. Instead, he turned toward a clay pot set near the coals. With unhurried hands he ladled broth into a wooden bowl and placed it before her. Steam curled into the air, carrying the scent of venison and herbs. Hunger, sharp and sudden, knotted in her stomach. She hesitated, pride and shame warring against need. But the memory of children peering from behind skirts, of laughter at her ruin, pressed her to surrender. She lifted the bowl, sipped, and warmth slid down her throat, thawing the ice within. Tears welled unbidden, scalding against her skin more than the broth itself. He sat across from her, cross-legged on the floor, silent as a mountain. In the flicker of the flames she saw the scars etched across his chest and arms. Marks of battles survived, wounds that had healed into reminders. Each scar told of pain borne and endured. She wondered what stories lay within them, what storms had carved those lines upon his flesh. Her own wounds were invisible, carved upon the soul where no one but herself could see. Yet in that moment, she felt less alone in them. The silence grew thick, not empty but full of something unspoken. She wanted to fill it, to beg or to explain, but words felt clumsy, unworthy. Instead she lowered her head and drank again, grateful for something as simple as heat. Outside, the storm battered the cabin walls, wind keening like a widow's lament. Inside, the fire popped, and the quiet between them stretched like a fragile thread binding two strangers. When her bowl was empty, she set it down with trembling hands. I don't belong here," she whispered, half to herself. "I don't belong anywhere." The confession cracked something inside her, and she pressed the blanket tighter around her shoulders, as if it might hide the naked truth. His gaze remained steady, unflinching, as though her words were not weakness but simple fact. At last he spoke, his voice low, rough as gravel yet calm as the river under ice. "Here you live. Nothing more. No promise, no threat. Just a fact, as certain as fire giving light." The words settled in her chest like a weight that was not heavy but grounding. "Here you live." It was more than her in-laws had offered, more than the town had dared. She nodded, a small motion, afraid that any larger acknowledgement might shatter the fragile peace. Exhaustion pressed upon her, heavier than stone. Her body begged for rest, though her mind circled like a frightened bird. Still wrapped in the fur, she lay down near the fire. The floor was hard, but the warmth soothed. Her eyes drifted shut, though she fought against the pull. Sleep was dangerous, trust foolish. But her body betrayed her resolve. When she woke, it was to silence deeper than before. The fire had burned low, embers glowing like hidden stars. The cabin was empty. Panic flared. Had he left? Had he only meant to shelter her for a night? She rose, weak still, and crept toward the door. The wood was cold beneath her fingers as she pulled it open. The night air rushed in, sharp and cruel, filling her lungs with frost. She blinked against the snow that still fell, softer now, a quiet veil over the world. And there he was. Not inside by the fire, but standing shirtless in the snow, his hair damp with frost, his breath rising in clouds. He stood unmoving, eyes fixed on the darkness of the trees beyond. Like a sentinel carved from earth and storm, he seemed less a man than some ancient guardian. Snow clung to his shoulders, to the scars across his chest, yet he did not shiver. His stillness was both terrifying and strangely reassuring. She understood then why he had brought her here. Not for possession, not for shame, but because his silence was shield enough against a world too cruel to offer mercy. Olivia drew the blanket tighter, and stepped back into the shadows of the cabin. Her heart beat hard, not with fear but with something new, an ember of safety she had not felt in years. The storm whispered through the trees, but its voice was muted, as though it too bent around the figure standing watch. She lay back down upon the floor, listening to the faint hiss of snow against the roof. Her eyes closed slowly, this time without resistance. And in the dark, with the image of the silent guardian fixed in her mind, she surrendered to sleep with the strange, trembling certainty that her life had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Morning broke sharp and brittle, the sky washed pale with the color of cold steel. Olivia wrapped herself in the fur blanket, and stood hesitantly at the threshold of the cabin. Behind her, the fire still smoldered, its warmth lingering, but the world outside called with a cruel urgency. She could not remain hidden forever. The town lay only a short walk away, its voices already seeping into her thoughts like smoke through cracks. If she stayed within these walls, the whispers would grow louder until they reached her even here. She needed bread, cloth, and, most of all, the courage to walk again where her shame had been carved. Taha watched from the table where he mended a strap of leather. He said nothing when she opened the door, only lifted his gaze once to meet hers. That steady silence unnerved her more than any words could, yet it carried no disapproval. It was a gaze that said, "Choose and live with the choosing." She tightened the blanket, stepped into the snow, and let the door fall closed behind her. The walk to town was short, but each step felt like trespass. Children played near the livery, their laughter fading when they noticed her. Women carrying baskets paused, lips pressed tight, their eyes sliding over her shorn head as though it were a brand. The men leaned against posts or gathered by the saloon, their mutters thick with judgment. Every glance was a stone thrown without hands. Jonas Pike, wiping a glass on his apron at the saloon doorway, was the first to speak. "Well, look who crawled out from the savage's den," he drawled, voice sharp enough to cut. His words carried, deliberate as a bell toll, ensuring every ear heard. "Guess she's found herself a new protector, eh? Shame don't keep a woman warm at night." Laughter rippled, low and mean, feeding on itself. Olivia's cheeks burned though the air was icy. She pulled the blanket tighter, fighting the sting of tears. Each cruel word confirmed the fear that had knotted in her chest since the moment she stepped beyond the cabin door. That she no longer belonged to herself, but to their whispers. Sheriff Amos emerged from his office, adjusting his hat. His gaze brushed over her, then quickly away, as though looking at her too long might stain him. "Best be careful, Olivia," he muttered when he drew close enough. "Living under that man's roof. Folks won't forget it. Some might not forgive it." His warning held no mercy, only cowardice dressed as concern. He walked on, leaving her with the weight of his inaction. But then, like a thread of light through storm clouds, Evelyn appeared. The sheriff's younger sister, with eyes soft as dusk, approached carrying a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. Her hands trembled as she pressed it into Olivia's. "You should eat," she whispered, voice thin but sincere. "Don't let them break you." Their eyes met, and for the first time that morning, Olivia felt something other than shame. Gratitude swelled, fragile and bright. Evelyn hurried away, head bowed. But the gift lingered in Olivia's hands like proof that kindness had not entirely died in this town. She turned back, clutching the bread to her chest. The walk to the cabin felt longer now, heavy with the echo of Jonas's laughter. Her feet carried her through the snow, but her heart sagged with the knowledge that she could never erase the mark burned upon her name. The whispers would follow, clawing at her no matter where she stood. Inside, Taha rose when she entered. He glanced at the loaf, then at her face, reading the tremor in her eyes without a question. He set down the leather strap and reached for her shoes, worn thin at the soles. Without speaking, he took them to the firelight, threading fresh twine, stitching with care. She watched in silence, astonished by the gentleness in his broad hands. He did not ask where she had gone, nor repeat the town's cruelty. He simply worked until the shoes were whole again, then placed them neatly by her side. It was a gesture so simple it broke her. Tears spilled, not from pain this time, but from the unbearable kindness of being seen as something worth mending. She turned her face away, ashamed of her weakness, yet the warmth of that small act seeped deeper than any fire. Days passed in this rhythm. Taha hunted, brought back venison, stacked wood high against the cabin wall. Olivia swept the floor, tended the fire, scrubbed the bowl after meals. They spoke little, but the silence grew softer, less like a chasm and more like a shared language. When the wind howled at night, he would place another log on the fire without being asked. When she faltered while carrying water, his hand steadied her elbow briefly, then fell away. Their bond formed not with de-evolutions but with gestures, each act a stone laid carefully on the fragile bridge between them. Yet outside, the whispers thickened. Jonas's words spread like brushfire. Stories of sin, of a widow sharing a bed with an Apache, of disgrace staining the settlement. Men gathered at the saloon, voices hardening with drink and anger. Some muttered of honor, others of fire. Olivia overheard one such conversation when she returned for water at the well. She stayed in the shadows as two men leaned close, voices grim. "Can't let it stand," one spat. "She's ours, part of this town, not his." The other nodded. "We drive her out, or we burn him out. One way or another it ends." Their words chilled her blood more than the snow. She fled, heart pounding, the water sloshing in the bucket as she stumbled back toward the cabin. That night, she sat by the fire, staring into the flames as though answers might rise with the sparks. Taha entered, carrying wood, and placed it gently upon the hearth. She turned to him, her voice trembling. "They hate me. They'll never stop." Her confession cracked like dry wood. "I don't know how long I can bear it." He looked at her, and for a long moment said nothing. Then he reached for his coat and laid it across her shoulders. The weight of it was immense, heavy with warmth and the scent of pine and smoke. She resisted at first, shaking her head, but his eyes held hers until her strength faltered. She let the coat settle, her body trembling beneath its weight. It was not comfort in words, but in presence. And in that presence, something shifted. The firelight caught her shorn head, casting it in gold instead of shame. For the first time she allowed herself to believe that perhaps dignity could be rebuilt, piece by fragile piece. Outside, the wind rose, carrying with it faint voices from town, low, angry, gathering strength. She closed her eyes, clutching the coat tighter, and in the silence that followed, she realized the storm was no longer only in the weather. The night cracked open with torchlight. Flames licked the darkness, a jagged procession of men moving through the snow toward the cabin. Their boots crunched in rhythm, their voices a low murmur of anger rising with every step. The storm had eased, leaving the world brittle and sharp, every sound carrying far in the frozen air. Olivia sat by the fire, sewing a tear in her dress with trembling fingers, when the first glow flickered against the window. Her breath caught. She knew before she stood what it meant. Taha was already at the door, broad shoulders casting long shadows across the walls. He did not reach for weapons, only pushed the door open and stepped into the cold. Olivia followed, heart pounding so loudly she feared it might shatter the silence before the mob reached them. The air outside was thick with the bitter tang of smoke. Torches swayed in the fists of men she had known all her life. Farmers, ranchers, men who had once nodded politely at her in the churchyard. Now their faces were hard, eyes narrowed, mouths twisted with the righteousness of anger. At their head stood Jonas Pike, his sneer lit hellish by the torch in his hand. "There she is," he spat, "hiding in the arms of a savage. You shame us all, Olivia Caldwell. You'll not bring your filth on this town any longer." Sheriff Amos lingered behind them, hat low, eyes uncertain. He made no move to stop the gathering, no hand raised to temper the flames. Olivia's stomach knotted. The law, once her faint hope, was nothing but silence. Her knees wanted to buckle. Every instinct begged her to run back inside, to hide in the shadows of the cabin. But the shame of her hairless scalp, the memory of laughter in the street, pressed her forward. She stepped into the snow barefoot, the cold biting so deep it felt like fire. The torches painted her pale skin in a cruel orange glow, but she forced herself upright. Her voice wavered, but carried. "You all turned your backs on me. He gave me shelter. He gave me bread. When you cast me out, he let me live." The crowd muttered, restless. Some spat in the snow. Others shifted uneasily, shame flickering behind their fury. But Jonas's laugh cut through. "Bread and a bed, that's what you mean," he jeered. "You'd rather lie with him than honor your own kin. Better we burn this place to ash before it stains us further." He took a step forward, raising his torch high. Olivia's breath caught as the flames wavered above the logs stacked against the cabin wall. She darted forward without thinking, her arms spread wide, blocking him. "No!" she cried, voice cracking. "If you burn it, burn me too. I will not move." The men faltered, murmurs rippling through them. Her bare scalp gleamed in the torchlight, once a mark of ridicule, now unveiled with defiance. For the first time, she stood not as a victim, but as a woman unwilling to bow. Shame became her shield. Jonas snarled, swinging the torch down toward her. But before it could fall, a shadow moved. Taha's hand clamped around Jonas's wrist, the torch halting inches from her face. Gasps tore from the crowd as the giant wrenched the man's arm, the fire sputtering into the snow. Jonas roared, swinging with his free hand, but Taha did not flinch. His body moved with controlled force, every strike precise, every motion measured. He did not fight like a drunk brawler, but like a wall of stone meeting the river, unyielding, inevitable. Men rushed forward, fists raised, but the snow churned red where they fell. Taha did not seek to kill, only to stop. Still, his power was terrifying. Olivia cried out, her voice slicing through the storm of fists and boots. "Stop! Please!" She ran forward, pressing herself between Taha and the men. Her breath came ragged, her chest heaving. The cold pierced her bones, but she stood firm, her arms spread wide once more. "Enough!" The crowd stilled, uncertain. Torchlight flickered on her face, her scalp bare, her body trembling yet unbroken. She turned slowly, meeting the eyes of each man who had once known her as neighbor, daughter-in-law, sister in Christ. "You wanted me gone. You stripped me, mocked me, cast me into the snow. And when he gave me shelter, you called it sin. But I will not bow to you anymore." Her voice cracked but did not break. "I would rather stand here in shame with him, than crawl back to your cruelty." Silence fell heavy as snow. Even Jonas, clutching his twisted wrist, could not find words. The torches guttered, their flames bending in the wind. Sheriff Amos shifted, his jaw tight, and for the first time his eyes rose to meet hers. He did not speak, but something in his gaze softened, as if a seed of truth had been forced upon him. Behind them, Evelyn appeared, drawn by the light and noise. She pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming as she watched Olivia stand defiant in the snow. The sight cracked something fragile in the onlookers. Murmurs turned uncertain, and one by one, men lowered their torches. The storm of fury faltered, quenched by the image of a woman who had nothing left to lose. Jonas cursed, his voice brittle. "She'll drag us all into ruin." But no one answered him. The fire in the mob had gone out. Men turned away, their boots crunching in the snow, leaving their leader stranded in his bitterness. Sheriff Amos lingered a moment longer, then tipped his hat to Olivia, a gesture small but heavy with acknowledgement, before following the others into the night. The clearing grew still, the snow whispering down once more. Olivia swayed, her body trembling from cold and exhaustion. Before she could collapse, Taha's arms encircled her, steady and strong. She sagged against him, not resisting this time. The crowd was gone, but their judgment lingered, heavy in the silence. And yet, for the first time, she felt the weight of something else pressing within her chest. Dignity, fragile but alive. Taha looked down at her, his breath fogging in the night air. His eyes, dark as the winter river, studied her face as though seeing her not as a burden, but as something unyielding. She closed her eyes, letting herself be carried, the world blurring into firelight and shadow. Inside the cabin, the fire still burned, its glow painting the walls in gold. He set her down gently, his silence louder than any vow. She lay back, body weak but spirit trembling with strange new strength. Outside, the snow was stained with footprints and blood. The storm had ended, but another storm, quieter, deeper, had only just begun. Morning seeped into the cabin slow and pale, the first gray light creeping through the cracks between the logs. The storm had passed, but its mark remained in the churned snow outside, and in the bruised silence within. Olivia woke beneath the fur blanket, her body aching, her scalp tender, her spirit raw yet strangely steady. She could still see the torches in her mind, still hear the mob's jeers dissolving into silence, still feel the moment when she had stood between fire and ruin. For the first time, she had not crumbled. Taha moved quietly about the cabin, his heavy frame casting broad shadows in the firelight. He stacked wood by the hearth, his movements unhurried, as though nothing in the night had unsettled him. But she saw the taut line of his jaw, the faint tremor of restraint in his hands. He had carried her through the worst of it, shielded her without asking for thanks, and now he moved as though prepared to keep doing so until the end of days. She rose slowly, her bare feet meeting the cold floor. For a moment she simply stood, watching him. Words lodged in her throat, uncertain and unwieldy, until finally one slipped free. "Why?" Her voice broke on the single syllable. He turned his head, brow furrowed slightly, not in confusion, but in silence heavy with meaning. She pressed on, trembling. "Why do you stand with me? The whole town would see me gone. Yet you fight for me. You guard me. Why?" He set down the wood and met her eyes. His gaze was steady, rooted, carrying more weight than any string of words. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, gravel rubbed against river stone. "Because you live." The same words he had offered before, but now they struck deeper, as if each syllable was forged from truth he carried like bone. Her breath shivered. To live. It was such a simple thing, yet everything she had been denied. Her in-laws had cut her down, the town had cast her aside, even God had seemed silent. Yet this man, whom they feared, spoke life into her as if it were undeniable. Tears welled, but she did not turn away this time. She let them fall, hot streaks down her cold cheeks, and whispered, "I don't want to live as nothing anymore. I want to belong. I want to matter." The fire crackled, filling the space between them. Taha stepped forward, his presence immense, filling the cabin like a force of nature. But his hand, when it reached for her, was gentle. He brushed one callous finger against her cheek, catching a tear, then let it fall. It was not a claim. It was acknowledgement. She closed her eyes, leaning into that single gesture, her shame loosening like snow melting under spring sun. Days bled into one another, slower, quieter. Olivia began to mend the cabin as if it were her own. She swept ashes, scrubbed bowls, mended worn cloth. Each act rebuilt a piece of her, not for others to judge but for herself. When she hummed softly by the fire, Taha would glance toward her, and though his face remained solemn, she sensed the flicker of something gentler in his eyes. He taught her to grind herbs, to set snares, to bind wood with leather. She learned in silence, and in silence she grew. Yet the shadow of town lingered. One afternoon, footsteps crunched outside. She stiffened, but Taha's hand brushed her shoulder lightly before he opened the door. Martha Caldwell stood there, her shawl drawn tight, bitterness etched into every line of her face. Behind her loomed two of Olivia's brothers-in-law, eyes sharp with disdain. Martha's voice cracked the air. "Come back with us. End this disgrace. You've shamed your husband's name long enough." Olivia's heart pounded. Old fear surged, urging her to shrink, to obey. But she lifted her chin, every wound from the night of fire burning anew. She stepped past Taha, into the snow, and faced the woman who had cut her down. Her voice trembled but held. "I will not return. You cast me out. You stripped me. You left me to freeze. He gave me life when you gave me nothing. I will not go with you." Martha's face twisted, but Olivia did not waver. Taha stood just behind, silent and immovable, his presence a wall at her back. The brothers-in-law muttered, but something in Olivia's stance stopped them. The pale gleam of her shorn head caught the winter sun, no longer a mark of shame but of survival. Martha spat into the snow, turned sharply, and left without another word. When the cabin door closed again, Olivia's knees shook, but her spirit soared with a fragile, blazing strength. She had chosen. She had spoken. She had stood. For the first time since her husband's death, her life was her own. That night, the world outside was hushed, snow lying soft as feathers across the land. Olivia sat by the fire, mending a tear in Taha's shirt. He returned from the cold, shoulders dusted with frost, and watched her for a moment. She looked up, her lips trembling into the faintest smile. He crossed the room and set a hand over hers, stopping her sewing. For a long breath they simply looked at one another, no words, no need. Then he lowered himself to the floor beside her. Their hands remained joined, her small, scarred fingers against his broad, calloused palm. In that quiet, she felt the truth settle deep into her bones. She was no longer alone. And she never would be again. The fire flared, sparks rising like stars, casting their faces in light. Outside, the snow kept falling, but inside there was warmth. a warmth not even the whispers of town could extinguish. She leaned against him, her head resting against the strength of his shoulder, and his arm curved around her without hesitation. She closed her eyes, hearing the faint echo of voices in the distance, knowing judgment would never fully vanish. But judgment no longer defined her. Dignity, chosen and earned, did. And beside her sat the man who had seen it before she could. The flames whispered against the wood, the storm hushed outside, and in the shelter of his silence she found her voice, soft but sure. "I'll never go back." Her words hung in the air like a vow. Taha's breath stirred her hair, and though he did not answer with words, the strength of his arm around her was answer enough. She smiled through tears, the ache in her chest loosening into something whole. For the first time in her life, Olivia felt what it meant to belong.